coming close to what that narrative is leading us to. Actually, I want you to notice verse 15. There's a word there in verse 15 that actually has the significance as it relates to our actual study this morning. My problem is, what I plan to do with you this morning is I want you to go into 1 Samuel chapter 25 here in a moment, and I'm going to camp out in 1 Samuel chapter 25 for our study this morning. But what I want you to notice in verse 15 is that he talks, back in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, he talks and uses that phrase, what connection does God have with Belial? And there's a man back in 1 Samuel chapter 25 who is described as Belial. His name in some ways becomes synonymous with that connection of that which is evil and sinful. In our Wednesday night and Sunday morning studies on the nature of God, if you recall when we talked about providence a couple of classes ago, we talked about the fact that how the story, if you will, of Nabal, David, and Abigail kind of illustrate how the providence of God can work. Nabal had one idea of how things should work. David had another idea of how things would work. Abigail comes into the picture and changes that whole scene in many ways completely. And we talked about how it didn't take a miracle, it didn't take God doing something supernatural in order to change the whole scope and history of that event. It happens through the providence of God putting the right people in the right place at the right time in the right circumstances. But then I got to thinking about this text and I thought, wow, there's a lot there. There's a lot of things within this piece of history that we can learn from. There are three distinct individuals that all have a different viewpoint of what's happening in front of them and how it is that they should be reacting to this set of circumstances. And so what I'd like to do with you this morning is just go into 1 Samuel chapter 25 and begin to walk through it. And let's look at the character and example of all three of these individuals and see what we can learn. Maybe some things to avoid, maybe some things to embrace, things that kind of help us appreciate the kind of character that God would be looking for from us as well. And let's start with the most challenged of the individuals in this particular scenario, and that is Nabal himself. Nabal lived in Moab, but his business was in Carmel, and so he's got various locations he is particularly connected to. He's big in the livestock business, and so he's got a lot of livestock that he's responsible for, 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats. That's a lot of animals in which he is responsible for and ownership of. So we might even argue pretty easily, I think, that he's pretty wealthy. He's got a lot of means. If he has the ability to own 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, he's a pretty wealthy individual. We also learn that he's of the family of Caleb, the tribe of Judah. And so he should be a man of God if he's choosing the right kinds of things. But that isn't necessarily the case that we find in relationship to him. Let's note then, now that we get the basic picture out of verses 1 and 2 of who he is in terms of his location and occupation and those kinds of things. But I want you to notice in verse 3, the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. And she was a woman of good understanding, of beautiful countenance, or beautiful appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. The first thing that kind of jumps out at me is the mismatched relationship here, right? Notice how she is defined and notice how he is defined. Notice that she is wise, a woman of great understanding, one who's also perceived as beautiful in their context. He, on the other hand, is harsh, abrasive, evil, not very suitable in some senses to the character and nature that she possesses. This is a mismatched relationship. And we're going to find out that it's ultimately going to be to his demise, we'll find later in the story. That she finally wisens up and kind of goes beyond what he would want her to do and resolves some conflict between he and David. But it's worth noting that this is mismatched. You know, back in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, what commonality, what bond, what yoke does God have with Belial? What reasoning would God have to connect himself to evil? And I think it's fair to say in some senses, what reasoning would she have to be connected to this man of evil? Now, we could argue all kinds of things. We don't know enough of the history to make a decision about that. of what happened at what point in time. But I just want you to know that they are not on the same page. And it creates difficulty and struggle because they're not on the same page. She's a person that seems to be respectful of God, of good understanding. He to the exact opposite. Notice verse 10 as we kind of just move through the narrative. Then Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away each one from his master." Now, I suppose maybe it'd be fair to just stop for half a second and remind you of what's happening. David's been protecting Nabal's servants and his flocks. He's been kind of working security. Nabal didn't necessarily ask him to do that, but by happenstance of where David and his men were located. Remember, I'm giving you way more history than I got time for in some senses, but remember, David's running. Okay, he's at this stage in his life, he's still running. He's running from Saul. And Saul's been pursuing everywhere he goes, trying to find David. Because if you recall, God has already said, Saul, you're out, David's going to be in. It just hasn't happened yet in terms of the timeline. And so Saul begins this pursuit. And so David finds himself in this location. And so he is willing to let he and his men be kind of protectors to Nabal's men and all the flock and sheep and goats that he has. And then David sent a simple request. We've been watching over your items here. We've been working security, and we'd just like to have some basic sustenance. Could you feed us? And could you provide for us just a few things that would aid and help me and my men as we've been protecting your servants? And that's when Nabal says, "Who is this David? Who is the son of Jesse? Who is this guy? Who is he to ask me? I'm Nabal. Who is David the son of..." Well, he happens to be the guy that God's chosen to be king, Nabal, but to you, I guess he's nothing. You think about the condescending tone that Nabal has, and completely ungrateful and unappreciative. And so let me suggest to you that there are two, that's twofold, by the way. Go back to verse 3 for a second. Nabal is very, in my estimation from the text, unappreciative of first his wife. He has a wife that's a beautiful appearance, and she's kind, and she's smart, and he's condescending and harsh and evil. Doesn't even care about what David has been providing for them. Notice verse 14. Now one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, "Look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he reviled them. But the men were very good to us, and we were not hurt, nor did we miss anything as long as we accompanied them when we were in the fields." He tells Nabal's wife, Abigail, he says, "Listen, I don't know what's wrong with your husband. I don't know what's wrong with him, because while these men are around, we were safe, we were protected. They didn't take anything, they didn't assume anything. They've been good to us. But he's reviled him." Verse 21, now David had said, "Surely in vain I have protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him, and he has repaid me evil for good." Sometimes in life you're going to run into individuals that do that. It doesn't make it right or good. It doesn't make it something that's acceptable. But the truth of the matter is, sometimes we're going to encounter some individuals that we will be nice, good, kind, all of the above. And we're going to be reviled in return. And we're going to be mistreated in return. And we're going to be disrespected in return. And sometimes condescended to in return. Even scorned for the good that we've done. It makes David even wonder, and I don't want to get too far ahead to David yet, but it makes him even wonder, why did I even bother? It's kind of a sad condition to get into, right? Why even bother doing good if I'm going to be mistreated, and if I'm going to be disrespected, if I'm going to be reviled and rejected even for doing good, then why bother being good? And it can be a temptation to us sometimes when we see individuals like Nabal and we encounter them in various connections and relationships, and we wonder in our own minds, why bother? And that's kind of the way David's gotten. It's a sad condition to get in where where now we don't even want to be kind anymore. In fact, David doesn't have kindness on his mind, does he? David completely turns from that kind, considerate mindfulness to what he tends to do to Nabal. Go back to verse 11 for a minute. I want you to see another piece of the character of Nabal that we need to learn from and avoid. Nabal's very self-centered. I want you to see how he speaks of himself. In fact, I think I put this verse on the screen for you. But he said, "Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from?" 7 times in one statement. 7 times in one statement, Nabal points to himself as the reason why he's not interested in aiding and helping David. This is my meat. This is my water. These are my provisions. I own them. It's my bread. And when you begin to think that way, it is kind of hard to be generous, isn't it? When we think about everything that we might have that could aid or help others, when we think of everything that even in some senses that we might own as being solely for my own personal interest and benefit, then that's a mistake to make. Sometimes we get into the mindset of Nabal a little bit, and we think very self-centeredly in relationship to what we've been blessed with by the hands of God, and we're not interested in being generous or kind or helpful. And we adopt the mindset of Nabal about I, me, and mine. And we teach children not to do that, and adults are the worst about it sometimes. And we talk about children about not being selfish, and they're supposed to share their toys and share their games and share their, right? And then we grow up and get grown-up toys, and they're mine, my, and I all of a sudden. We've got to be careful. Part of Nabal's problem is he is just so entirely self-centered, and it's all about him or nothing. And because of that, he becomes the son of Belial. He becomes the very thing that 2 Corinthians chapter 6 said we can't be connected to. It's what makes people unequally yoked together when you're trying to connect good and Belial, when you're trying to connect that which is righteous and good to that which is not. Notice 17, not a great way to be described, by the way. But notice, "Now therefore know and consider what you will do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a scoundrel that one cannot speak to him." I think some translations use son of Belial in that narrative. He has become such a scoundrel that he's going to bring harm to all of us. Part of that self-centered mindset is not only about things and possessions. A self-centered mindset also doesn't care what destruction it causes to those around me. When I become self-centered and it's all about me and everything's pointing back at me, whether good or bad, not only do I not care whether I'm generous or helpful or kind, but I also don't care what I leave in my wake. I also don't care what destruction I might cause. Or my refusal to help David isn't just going to affect me, Nabal, it's going to affect those men. Who are the first ones that are going to see the brunt of David's anger? Well, it's the men and the servants that have been out there that David's been protecting. Who are the first ones that are going to suffer consequence because of Nabal's actions? You see, self-centeredness isn't just about being selfish with things. It's also about being selfish with the trouble and difficulty and harm that I can cause to other individuals. He's definitely a scoundrel. By definition, literally, of no value. Worthless. Now, you might say, "Brian, you don't have a right to say that about somebody." Well, I didn't. The Bible did. That's the description of this man. He has become of no value. And even synonymous, as we read a little while ago, with Satan himself. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 15. Nabal's not a good man. And he's causing difficulties and challenges for everyone. And they're imploring Abigail to realize the difficulties. But Nabal was unapproachable, unreasonable. And friends, when we become that way, it will create difficulties for ourselves and also those around us. Notice verse 25. Please let not my Lord regard this scoundrel Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now that's Abigail speaking, but she's talking about Nabal in that moment, and she talks about how he is foolish. Please don't hold it to our charge that he's folly. His very name is folly. I imagine Abigail had seen enough. I imagine she had seen enough from Nabal to know what kind of man he was. In fact, fast forward, we'll see this again before we're done, but notice verse 36, he said, and Abigail went to Nabal, and there he was, holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. Therefore she told him nothing, little or much, until morning light. Throwing a feast fit for a king, though he wasn't. And here in this drunken party, he finds himself in. There's not a lot of redeeming qualities about Nabal. In fact, I struggle to find even one where we could find something redeeming about him. He is not the kind of character that we'd want to possess or we'd want to exemplify. When we become a scoundrel, unapproachable, unreasonable, harsh and evil, a son of Belial, then we become destructive towards those that are around us as well. But David, let's add him to the picture here for a minute. So that's Nabal, that's his side of this story. But what about David? And so here's another good deed done by David, right? He's been protecting Nabal's men and his herds and therefore his prosperity, even though it's been going unrewarded. And so they've been doing that for a period of time. Now they're hungry, they're weary, and they simply just want simple refreshment as payment for the security. Now keep in mind, David and his men could have overpowered them and just taken the possessions. They could have just robbed him in some senses, just taken those things that they needed from him. But they chose to make a request. David chose to make the request. And Nabal, as we saw already, refuses. And he even makes that great statement, well, who's David? And as often men do, you insult me, I'm going to do what? I'm coming back at you. Now I'll fast forward a little bit here, but it takes a wise woman to fix two ignorant men, right? In this situation. Who aren't wise enough to understand what they're going through here in the situation. And David's being lured to become like Nabal if he's not careful in this picture. Abigail, on the other hand, as we already noted in verse 3, beautiful in appearance, but more importantly, verse 3, she's wise. She's able to see beyond this circumstance and the male ego that now is at war with one another between Nabal and David. And she's going to use this good understanding that she's built. She knew when to talk, how to approach, when to leave him alone. She'll use what she's gained and the wisdom. I think we saw that evident in verse 36 that we read. Remember, she comes back, she finds him, he's in the great feast, he's drunk, and what does she decide to do? I'm not saying nothing until morning light. She has an understanding of what's happening among Nabal and David, and she's going to use that wisdom and prudence to be able to dissolve what could be a pretty serious situation when you think about it. David calls his men to go to war. They're going to go to war, and it's not going to be pretty for anybody if she can't find a way to find resolve and answers. And so she knew what it took to diffuse this tense situation between these two men. Notice again verse 17 in the narrative. They now know and consider what you will do as they speak to Abigail. Harm is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a scoundrel. Make a decision, Abigail, how you're going to handle this, because trouble's on the horizon. It's coming. Notice verse 25. Please let not my Lord regard this scoundrel Nabal, for as his name is, so he is. Or so is he. I think Abigail, in some ways, kind of knows her husband a little bit. She knows, obviously, the kind of man he is. Obviously, the servants know what kind of man he is. He's evidenced himself to them. She's kind of used to this and uses the wisdom that she's gained to keep a calmer, cooler approach to the circumstance. Notice verse 19. And she said to her servants, go on before me, see, I am coming after you. But she did not tell her husband, Nabal. She stays calm. Even though this could become serious for her and a challenge to her and difficult for her because she's going against what Nabal wanted to do, but she's keeping a calmer approach than he did. In fact, she takes some initiative. Back up a verse. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. She's going to take enough to feed them. The provisions that they asked for. She's keeping a much cooler and calmer head in this situation. Nabal just says, who's David? I don't care who he is. I'm not feeding him or his people. All these things belong to me. Verse 11. David, now when he hears that, he gets angry and he just wants to go to war and deal with Nabal. But Abigail, willing to kind of try to find some resolve and some answer, takes upon herself some initiative to actually respond in kindness. If sometimes in life we might find ourselves in a circumstance where we're put between two conflicting circumstances. And we're going to have to be calm, and we're going to have to keep a cooler head. We're going to have to use a greater sense of wisdom. We're going to have to apply our understanding. And we're going to have to be careful that we use that wisdom in a way that's going to diffuse the challenge and difficulty that may be being experienced. And so she takes what they needed. In verse 18, she supplies with them what they had expected or desired. It's to sidestep her husband's authority to do that. So let me stop you for a second there. What I appreciate about that is no man has an authority over his wife in such a way where she is not allowed to do what God would want her to do. God never gave husbands the power and control and authority over their wife in such a way where He can dictate to her that she is not allowed to do what God is expecting of her. She can't do what is right because I'm the position of authority in this connection and relationship. Abigail did not have Nabal's authority to feed David's men. She did not have authority to go approach David. She did not have his approval to go and act in this way, but she knew it was right. She knew what God would expect of her. She did what was right and what God expected, irregardless of whether her husband approved or disapproved of that. And by the way, you can flip that if you want to. There may be others in our lives that maybe even have positions of authority over us. No one has a right to tell you not to do what God said is right. No one has so much authority that it breaches or goes beyond what God's authority is. And Nabal decides to be his typical self-centered, egotistical self. And she has to apply the wisdom of God and do what is right without His approval and without His help. And I believe this is a great biblical example to illustrate to us. Well, if it's right, it's right. Irregardless of what some other authoritative figure might be saying or reacting to. And notice, she's quite different than her husband. When Abigail saw, verse 23, David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey, fell on her face before David, and bowed down to the ground. Her husband says, "Who is this David? I don't even know who you're talking about. Who's the son of Jesse?" She gets off the donkey and falls down and bows down before him in respect for who he is. So she fell at his feet, verse 24, and said, "On me, my Lord, on me let this iniquity be." Now you talk about, wow. And what I love about her in some ways here, by the way, is she could have said, "Go get him." Right? Now we realize what's going to eventually happen to him. God's going to deal with him. But she didn't say, "He is a horrible man, David. You have every right to know." What I love about her is she's doing what's right, even though his authority didn't say she could. She's stepping out on her own initiative, doing what God would expect of her. But what I appreciate about it is when she comes to David, she says, I'll take responsibility. It wasn't her responsibility to take. It wasn't her fault. That he's a scoundrel and foolish and filled with folly. But she maybe in some ways is wiser than we give her credit for, because she could have created even a greater conflict here, right? If she had gotten there basically and said, "David, I'm on your side, let's go." That's not what she does. "I'll take responsibility. Please let your maidservant speak in your ears and hear the words of your maidservant. Please listen." She comes respectfully. Now, she doesn't cover for him. She's willing to accept responsibilities, but notice verse 25. "Please let not my Lord regard this scoundrel Nabal." Here's that verse we've already read. "For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent." There's a couple of things I want you to notice. Number one, she said, "David, it's not worth it." Why would you change who you are? Now, I understand the whole history of David, right? We can look back and see all that. And so we know that he was a man after God's own heart. We understand the history of his anointing and all that. My point is, what she says to him is, "Why are you even thinking about doing something to Nabal? He's been foolish forever. His name is folly, David. You'll only lower yourself to his level, and he won't care, in some senses. You'll become a scoundrel like him, and now you're not the man you used to be, and he's no different, not changed by it. It's not worth it." I know the temptation is to deal with a scoundrel as a scoundrel. I know the temptation is to fight fire with fire. I know the temptation is to respond and react in kind. That's David's initial reaction. I'm going to go deal with him. When I used the word ignorant earlier in the text, I simply mean that by the sense of without knowledge and thinking. Nabal's ignorant seemingly permanently in his choices and decisions. David is about to act ignorantly without wisdom and knowledge in his response to Nabal until Abigail interjects. She doesn't cover for him and say, "Oh, he's really a nice guy. He's having a bad day." No. She tells the truth, but she encourages David to realize, don't make the mistake of stooping to his level. Don't make the mistake of becoming like him in trying to deal with him. You and I find ourselves in circumstances in life like that when we're dealing with a scoundrel. Unfortunately, there seems to be some of those running around sometimes in life. Beware of the temptation to want to deal with them in the same manner in which they're dealing with us. It doesn't mean we excuse them. It doesn't mean we cover up their guilt. But we try to not act and conduct ourselves as they have in the process. In fact, to the contrary, notice she points to the Lord. Verse 26. "Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, since the Lord has held you back from coming to bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek harm for my Lord be as Nabal." Because you've restrained yourself. And notice she kept pointing, because of God's will. Let's serve God's purposes and His will. And again, her willingness to take all the blame and responsibility, even though it wasn't hers. And then she reminds him that he has greater purpose than dealing with a man like Nabal. Notice verse 29. Yet a man has risen to pursue you and seek your life, but the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the pocket of a sling. Well, isn't that interesting? I don't know that that's coincidental, by the way. That the word sling comes up in relationship to David. I don't suppose that's coincidental. And I don't suppose she's being coincidental or accidental here. I think she knows the history. She seems to have a very clear understanding of the history as it relates to David, as it relates to what's happening to him, Saul's pursuits, as it relates to what God desires for him and the purpose he has. It's almost that she sees it more clearly than maybe David does in some ways. And so, the Lord's going to use you and has purpose for you. She reminds him of that. It shall come to pass when the Lord has done for my Lord according to all the good that He has spoken concerning you and has appointed you ruler over Israel. David, you've got greater things coming than to bother with Nabal. There are bigger things ahead of you. Greater things. And friends, I think sometimes we waste a whole lot of our energies and time on things that may never be resolved and never fixed, never corrected. Maybe even people sometimes who have no desire to try to turn or change or have any ounce of remorse or penitence. And there's greater things that God has intended for us. There are greater things out in front of us to be acting foolishly as it relates to a man of folly, a son of Belial like Nabal. Friends, sometimes we've got to recognize Nabal for what he is and quit wasting our time. David, it's not worth it. And you'll just drag yourself right down into the same destructive mindset that Nabal has if you stoop to that. The Lord's got greater purpose for you, David, than to bother with Nabal. Let's think about those things instead. She's extremely wise. And so she urges David, think of the consequences. Think about if you choose to go after him, that this will be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord, either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when the Lord, capital L, has dealt with my Lord, then remember your maidservant. There's going to be consequences if you decide to go on the offensive. And do you really have a cause to go shed Nabal's blood and potentially the innocent lives that are around him? Let the Lord deal with my Lord. Let the Lord deal with Nabal. So she pleads for the lives of her husband, her family, and those that might get caught up in the wake of David and his men coming forth. And pleads that they let the Lord deal with it. And then that thought of remember me when you become king. She understood what it took to diffuse a pretty challenging situation. And she used wisdom and understanding. She was vulnerable and open, willing to discuss these matters with David in a way that was respectful and honorable. And a little helping of food, a big serving of praise, along with a generous portion of humble wisdom, diffuses what could have been a very tragic and horrible set of circumstances. So who are we in this picture? Where do you see yourself among these three individuals? We could have studied further. I think I've fed you enough this morning. We could have looked further. Ultimately, when Abigail tells Nabal all these events and circumstances that happen, he has a heart attack, and then a few days later, the Lord lets him go. Abigail becomes the wife of David after that. But I just want you to see how Nabal's conduct almost pulled David to act accordingly. And if it were not for the kindness and the wisdom of Abigail, how horrible that circumstance could have been, and how different it could have been. And the point I'm simply trying to make, friends, is let's do the best that we can to be the Abigail of that story. Don't be the hard-headed son of Belial, the scoundrel Nabal. Don't be the reactionary David who wants to deal with the scoundrel, foolish, folly Nabal. Be the Abigail who uses wisdom and understanding and continues to point to the Lord and says, let's do what's right. Let's do what's right. And let's remember the consequences, and let's not get pulled in to the mindset of foolishness when there are greater things to be accomplished, greater good to be honored. And this morning you may be subject to the gospel in some way. What greater good could there be than to find remission of sins through the blood of the Lamb? The authority of Jesus is what we point to. And if the authority of men point us in any other direction than where Jesus has led us to, then we've been led the wrong way. Choose what is right in the eyes of God to the saving of our soul. Honor Him. And if you've yet to find that remission of sins through the blood of the Lamb, or need to return to Him and find a stronger relationship with God, and we can pray for you this morning, we'd invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.